We cross now to Dr Elna Moolman. She's the head of macroeconomic fixed income and currency research at Standard Bank. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr Moolman. So, of course, very refreshing to hear some young voices at university tackling the issue of debt default. But before we get into that, just, take us through what it is that you expect to come out of the budget, the midterm budget, the key things that you'll be looking at.
Good afternoon. So I think there are basically going to be two issues. Usually we focus on the fiscal forecast, so the government deficit size, the government debt trajectory, and what government expects over the next 3 years. This time around, we're still looking for those indications, but we're essentially assuming that it will be largely the same as it was in February. So from a fiscal perspective, probably not a lot of changes. And it will be good news if they're still sticking to those forecasts. It signals that they are committed to improving the fiscal situation and ensuring that it is on a sustainable path. And so with that as reasonably boring, I think there will be significant focus on general economic policy. So here I'm specifically referring to the reforms that we've embarked on to boost trend growth. And of course, Treasury is intimately involved in that. They're a partner in Operation Vulindlela. And those reforms is why we're already seeing, of course, a reduction in load shedding, and they're now similarly intervening in other sectors of the economy. So I expect to see more announcements around what they're planning for the next 5 years, their priorities, etc. And then alongside that, I think specific emphasis on infrastructure. So my sense is there's a very strong drive to accelerate infrastructure spending. And what I'd expect to see is announcements around how they're going to partner with the private sector to accelerate infrastructure spending.
Yeah. And then the issue of debt default. I mean, what is it? What are the consequences of it? And how far is South Africa, or is South Africa miles away from being in that position?
I think the students actually did a very good job in terms of explaining what that is. Very similar to a household situation. So if you're overextended and can't repay your debt on time as scheduled, that would be a debt default. Now, very often we don't see that governments actually default on their debt, but they get very close and can't repay on time. And then, similar to the case of many households, there would be a debt restructure. In other words, a negotiation with your creditors to say, I can't pay on time, but let's work out a schedule, that is realistic for this government to afford. South Africa is still reasonably far from that. But that hinges on two things. One is government's commitment from a fiscal perspective to say, given our revenues, what is a realistic expenditure path? What can we afford to spend? And I think Treasury has clearly signaled commitment to that. So they're taking the right decisions from a fiscal perspective to reduce the government deficits and therefore help to improve the debt situation. The other side of that is growth. Ultimately, government's revenues are dependent on economic growth, and that's why the reforms that I talked about earlier is so important. It's those reforms, the addressing the electricity shortfall, the fixing the logistics bottlenecks, etc., that will put us on a higher growth path, which is then supporting government's revenues, and that then makes it easier for government to improve its general fiscal situation.
Excellent. Elna, thank you very much for those insights. That was Dr Elna Moolman. She's the head of macroeconomic fixed income and currency research at Standard Bank.